Good evening and welcome to this meeting of the Norfolk Select Board. My name is Kevin Kalka, the chair of the Norfolk Select Board. Permit me to confirm that all members and persons anticipated on tonight's agenda are present and can hear me. Members, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. Anita Mecklenburg?
Here.
Cece Van Tine?
Aye.
Staff, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. Blythe Robinson?
Here.
Judith Lizardi?
Here.
Thank you very much. So as a quick introduction, this open meeting of the Norfolk Select Board is being conducted remotely, consistent with Governor Baker's executive order of March 12, 2020, due to the current state of emergency in the Commonwealth due to the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus. In order to mitigate the transmission of the COVID-19 virus, we have been advised and directed by the Commonwealth to suspend public gatherings, and as such, the governor's order suspends the requirement of the open meeting law to have all meetings in a publicly accessible physical location. Further, all members of public bodies are allowed and encouraged to participate remotely. The order, which you will find posted with the agenda materials for this meeting, allows public bodies to meet entirely remotely, so long as reasonable public access is afforded so that the public can follow along with the deliberations of the meeting. With that being out of the way, Blythe, would you mind taking us through our very concise but very important agenda this evening?
Of course. Can you see the presentation on my screen?
I cannot see anything just yet, Blythe.
Everybody else is muted.
You're not screen sharing yet.
Right, let me. How's that?
There we go, much better.
Great, thank you. Okay, good evening, everybody, and thank you for attending the meeting. My goal for the meeting is to provide a thorough and transparent review of this project from 2009, when the town meeting approved the formation of the committee, through today. To prepare for this, I've interviewed people from all aspects of the project, reviewed meetings and documents, and gathered insights and information about what happened and why. I found that there are a number of positive outcomes from this project, as well as things that didn't go as planned. At the end, the project cost more than it was expected. I fully appreciate the frustration that a number of residents have expressed because they trusted the town with their tax dollars, and the project cost more than they were told it would. I hope to clarify some of the misconceptions, explain how decisions led to outcomes, point out things I think could have been avoided, provide recommendations as to how projects might be effectively managed in the future, and give a synopsis of available funds and next steps to replace the fire station. So I'd like to start with some meeting objectives. Tonight, we're looking to cover a timeline of the project and its history, an overview of laws in the procurement process that govern projects like this, the impact of the Metacomet Emergency Communications Center, or the MECC, on the project, review the purchase of Sharon Avenue, the various consultants hired, construction and costs, and decision points and insights for future projects and the fire station's next steps. So to start with a little history, the original building at 117 Main Street was constructed in 1966, just over 6,500 square feet. The town was much smaller at the time, so there were 4 officers. A volunteer fire and dispatch was offsite, likely in someone's home. In 1985, there was a 3,000 square foot addition, and that is still the size of the building today at 9,600 square feet. And when that happened, we were up to 17 officers, 13 career firefighters, and communication center of 1 dispatcher per shift in the building. Jumping forward, the MECC was formed in 2013. And right after that, in 2014, Sharon Avenue site was selected by the town and the MECC. It was purchased in 2014. The actual construction of the project began in 2017, and the police station and the MECC opened on May 5th in 2019. So I think it's helpful to understand the differences between 2009, when this project really got underway, and 2016, when the funds were approved and the final design and construction got underway. In 2009, it was envisioned to be a 27,000 square foot joint police and fire station at the same location on Main Street, using land acquired from the Federated Church, also in 2009. And the project budget was $10 million. If you do the math on that, the per square foot price at the time was $370. But the project didn't go forward. It came up at town meeting and on the ballot at the same time as Freeman Kennedy School, and this project failed by less than 30 votes. And the project had a pause for a couple of years. The building committee rarely met until the MECC started to become something that the four towns were exploring. And after that got going. And so when we jumped to 2016, now we're talking about 41,000 square feet of buildings, police station being at 14 Sharon Avenue, and you can see the square footage for that, which included the MECC. The fire station would grow to be just under 17,000 square feet, and the project budget had increased to 14 million. If that amount of square footage could have been built for 14 million, the project cost dropped to $340 a square foot. So I'd just like to touch on the building committee itself. It was formed by town meeting in 2009. We have had some questions about permanent building committees. I will just make a note that there had been a permanent building committee on the town's bylaws. That was removed from the bylaws in 2007, replaced with a different version I'll explain later. And in 2009, as I said, town meeting did appoint this committee, and it was made up of four members, who were residents chosen by the select board, the police chief, fire chief, town administrator, a select board member, and the building commissioner, who was a non-voting ex officio member. The initial committee did have four residents until 2015. From that point to 2018, there were two resident members, and in 2019, at the end of the project, just one resident member. So a little bit of history about the acquisition of 14 Sharon Avenue. When the MECC was moving towards being formed, it was originally planned to be built in Rentham at their police station. That did not work out. It was determined that there was not enough space to build it there. And so the then committee of four towns started looking in all four towns and chose 14 Sharon Avenue for a variety of reasons. It's my understanding that it was chosen because it was next to the town's water tower, Norfolk's tower, so there was thought that it could be used for to house communications equipment. The building was essentially a shell, so possibly easily renovated at high elevation, which would help with radio transmission, and it was likely built big enough to be used for both police and the MECC. So the initial price was thought to be about $1 million. And the project budget was derived at $1.8 million. And you can see on the screen how that was broken down. That was approved by town meeting in May of 2014. And later that year, the select board authorized the property to be taken through eminent domain, and they acquired the parcel. So I think it's helpful to understand what laws govern projects like this. Public construction and the rules that we need to follow are quite different from the private sector. As I mentioned earlier, first of all, just appointing a committee follows town meeting and the bylaws of the community. And just the citation for that says when a project will exceed 5% of the general fund budget, that generates the requirement for a building committee. Once that happens, the first thing that a building committee is supposed to do is hire an owner's project manager. That's governed by state law, required for all projects over $1.5 million. Following that, the owner's project manager then assists the building committee in the town with hiring the architect, also under state law. Once all the design is done and you're ready to build a project, projects that are buildings or vertical construction, towns required to follow Chapter 149. And then if there are any goods or services needed as part of a project, they follow Chapter 30B. So I think that the MEC had quite a impact on the direction of this project and some of the costs that were incurred at the end. So just a little bit about that. It was actually formed by intermunicipal agreement in 2013 between the 4 communities. And there is one board member from every town, and they are designated to be the town administrators. As I mentioned, it was planned in Rentham, but that fell through. The state is very keen to see regional dispatch centers. They prefer that over having 911 equipment that they must maintain in every single town otherwise. And so they began providing grants to the MEC even before it was fully formed from FY12 through FY17 that ultimately paid for the MEC's portion of the construction at 14 Sharon Avenue. And early on in the process, JHA Architects, which ended up being the town's architect as well, did perform some analysis for the MEC on the space needs that they would have for a regional facility. So why the MEC? Why is it different or perhaps better than having dispatch individually in each community? So for the town of Norfolk, the MEC pays both rent and for custodial services that we provide. It provides multiple dispatchers on a shift. And today there are 6 dispatchers on a shift and 1 supervisor on all but the midnight shift. It provides enhanced technology that likely communities such as Norfolk or Plainville and one of the small communities in the group couldn't necessarily afford on their own. It provides situational awareness, coordination of regional resources. It's a more efficient operation than each town doing it themselves. And in a major event, the ability to have multiple people available to coordinate multiple agencies is critically important. The MEC has actually changed since it was formed in 2013 and opened in 2019. We are about to add 2 new towns in 2021, Mendon and Millville. They're in a joint dispatch now in Mendon, and they'll be moving over to ours at the request of the state, which will lower Norfolk's share of the costs in the future. And as it's laid out now, the MEC can still accommodate 1 more community after that. So what's the financial aspects of all of this? We've had several questions. Well, if the building at 14 Sharon Avenue didn't have a 2nd floor when you bought it, how much did it cost to build? Well, approximately $1 million. So as I mentioned earlier, the MEC makes payments for rent and custodial services in FY21. You can see the rent on the screen is just over $53,000. That started out as a $50,000 payment. It increases by 3% a year, and the contract with the MEC goes through 2040. And custodial services just over $38,000 a year, and that contract was just renewed earlier this week by the Select Board. When the MEC was formed, Norfolk's share of the costs was 16%. That's based on the population of each community and the call volume. We're fairly equal to the town of Rentham in that regard. By adding Mendon and Millville in 2021, our assessment is going to drop to 12% of the cost. And because the state was such a priority to continue to regionalize, they provided grants to the MECs over 4 years that are going to offset the cost of each of the towns paying in to operate it. For Norfolk, that's going to be worth $1,045,000. If you were keeping an eye on our budget this year, our operational budget, you will have noticed that our share, we dropped it to $95,000 from almost $400,000, and we only kept in that amount in case we needed it for just cash flow for the MEC. We haven't and our assessment next year will be 0 as well. I'd like to stop there for a second. I've covered a lot of ground, especially about the MECC, and I'd be happy to take any questions. And certainly we'll have time for questions at the end. So Mr. Moderator.
Hey, everybody. So if anybody has any questions or would like to raise their hand to touch on anything that we've covered up at this point, you can do so by using the raise hand function. You find that by hitting the participants icon on the bottom toolbar. When you raise your hand, we will call on them in the order they were received. So we do have a question, Blythe. Our first question is from Mr. Rosenberg. If you would be so kind, sir, before you ask your question, if you could just cite your full name and your address. Thank you.
David Rosenberg, 123 North Street in Norfolk. My understanding is at the time that we acquired the building at 14 Sharon, there was there were some items that we acquired as part of that we were not to use in the reconstructed version of it. I wondered if you could address whether there were any such items and how they were disposed of, whether they were sold or given away or junked or what happened to them. One example that I heard was that there were doors that were worth in aggregate about $2,000, but I don't know if that's a fact.
Sure. So I can speak specifically to the doors. The building had 9 doors, as I understand it, when it was acquired. We intended to use and are using 3 of those original doors. The other 6 needed to be removed. We did retain, and we have stored down at the old town hall behind it any of the parts and panels from those doors that are usable again. If there were parts of the doors that couldn't be used, those were disposed of. I'm not aware of any other material, but Mr. Hafner is joining us at the meeting. He may have other knowledge that I do not.
Good evening. The building was basically just a shell. It was an unfinished construction project. So besides the overhead doors, the other parts that came out were a sprinkler system that was black metal piping and fittings that had to come out, and I think 2 passage doors, man doors. Everything else was just structural steel and corrugated steel on the exterior. That was it. That was the extent of it.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Blythe and Matt. We have another question from Mr. Haddad. Go right ahead, sir.
Thank you. I have a 2-part question on the property itself. I'd like to understand how that property valued at $1 million, who evaluated that, where did that come from, and why wasn't the site, why didn't town-owned land was available instead of buying the site?
So I will cover the appraisal and the value of the property in an upcoming slide. You're getting ahead of me a little bit, Mr. Haddad.
Thank you.
As to town-owned land, I'm not familiar if there are any other sites that were looked at in Norfolk, but I would say generally that there likely wasn't another Norfolk site that would have been large enough for the footprint. For instance, Old Town Hall is a site with wetlands on it and other restrictions that made it probably not likely, but I don't have that history any further than that. I can certainly try to find out.
Thank you.
Ed, for the sake of completeness, could you please just state your name and your address for us?
Oh, sorry. Ed Haddad, 138 Red Maple Run.
Thank you, sir. Do we have any other questions before we move on? Blythe, I am not seeing any other questions at this time, so please proceed.
So Mr. Haddad, here's the slide you were waiting for. So in 2014, FY14, the property was assessed by the assessors at $639,000, and you can see the breakdown on the screen. Because the building wasn't finished, as Mr. Hafner just noted, the value for that was at 50%. It's my understanding that the building was never formally on the market for sale. It was, I guess, available possibly for sections of it to be leased. After the owner became aware that the property was possibly of interest to the town, they expressed an interest for $1,250,000. Looking back at the records, all I can say is there must have been some understanding of what the probable outcome cost would be for the property, because the town went to town meeting in May for $1,800,000, as I've mentioned already, and then needed to then acquire it. The owner wasn't interested in selling it for less than he was. And so the town had to follow, if they wanted the property, they had to follow the eminent domain process in state law, Chapter 79. That requires that a community obtain an arm's length appraisal, and that was done. I'm sorry, I don't recall the company's name at this moment, but I can tell you that I have reviewed that with our assessor's office, and they indicate to me that they felt it was a thorough appraisal from a qualified firm, a gentleman who's got a number of decades of experience in the business. He used the sales comparison and income approach because it was commercial property to determine the value. He looked at comparable sales for other buildings in the 495 South Market and came up with an appraised value of 1.1 million. State law is going to require that you pay something close to that. And in fact, that's what happened in October of that year. The 1,109,000 at the bottom of the screen includes the purchase price, the cost of the appraisals, and some legal work. So I was assuming there might be some questions at this point, Kevin, in case we need to take a break.
I will open it up for any questions at this time. I did have one that was passed through the chat. Donna, if you can hear me, are you able to read this question aloud?
Hi, this is Donna Jones.
Go right ahead, Donna.
My understanding is Shire Ave and part of Sharon Ave are an industrial park. The owner had presented their complete plan to the planning board. The plans included installing utilities, meaning electricity, drainage, water, how sewer would be processed, maybe gas for heating, etc. Fire hydrants, paving, and the responsibility of the owner compared to each tenant. Some tenants moved in, some lots were untouched, and the roadway was not completed, leaving raised manhole covers and poor pavement conditions. The owner went into bankruptcy. A bank became the owner of the property, and the town did not have as-built plans on file. Perhaps not having the as-built plans slowed the town's Sharon Ave project. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Blythe, did any of what Donna just outlined either line up with what we've been able to find out about what led up to the acquisition of this site, or was that different from our understanding?
As far as I know, and not being here, it's a little hard to have all of the information. I understand there were issues with the developer of the industrial park, and that person did go bankrupt, but I'm not aware that it had any impact on this particular parcel. But there may be other people on the call who have that history that I do not.
Excuse me, Matt Hafner. There were some as-built plans and information that we were able to utilize for, it didn't have all the exact locations, but there were rudimentary as-built plans for that development.
Thanks, Matt. Do we have any other questions before we move on? Blythe, I am seeing no hands at this time, so please proceed.
So now I'd like to talk more about the consultants that were hired and the process for that. So when a community has hired wants to go ahead and hire the owner's project manager and the architect thereafter, they need to follow a request for proposal process, or RFP, which is a qualifications-based process. They put out a document and require submissions from firms. It's looking for those that have experience in public safety projects. For a project like this, they look at the years of experience of that firm, the financial capability of the firm, the experience of the staff involved, that sort of thing, and turn those in to the town. After that, the building committee would have read all those proposals, screened out the most qualified firms, interviewed the firms with, they thought, the best match of experience, and conducted reference checks. It's my understanding that this happened for both hiring the OPM and the architect. So let's talk a little bit about the owner's project manager. The building committee hired CDR McGuire. Or we're going to refer to as CDR after this. It was a complicated situation from the start all the way to the finish for the town. The OPM team that the committee thought they were hiring left the firm shortly after that, and CDR assigned a new staff person. That person stayed with the project, but then left just after construction began, which was a little bit disruptive. And then CDR hired a third person for which, in the town's opinion, had performance issues that were unacceptable to the community. So the town at the time took action to terminate that firm. As a result of that, CDR brought mediation against the town because that was the process by which our contract with them required. And CDR also filed a claim against the MECC because, as you probably have come to understand by this point, the MECC and the town were moving kind of in parallel to each other through this project. At the end of the day, the town paid to CDR an undisputed portion of invoices that totaled $40,000 that the town had been holding back. So here we are in construction without an OPM. I understand that the committee made several attempts to find another firm to do the work, but with the economy busy and a lot of work out there, they had at least two firms turn them down because they were busy. They made an offer to an engineer with another firm to try and hire that person to take over the project. That didn't work out. And at that point, they thought it through a bit further and determined the best approach was to appoint existing town staff to be the OPM. In this particular case, an OPM has to have one of three types of experience. Either have to be a registered architect, an engineer, or they have to have 7 years of construction experience, commercial construction experience. On staff, our building commissioner, Mr. Bob Bullock, has more than 7 years of commercial construction experience. And it was determined that Mr. Hafner who is our facilities director, could work under him to carry out the project, especially as Mr. Bullock was not a voting member of the committee. Turning to the architect, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the MECC had hired JHA to perform a space needs study early on. And the town, even with that, the town went through the similar process I just mentioned and selected JHA for the police station project in 2015. On the screen is the dollar amounts that the town had planned to pay or contracted to pay JHA for both the police station and the fire station. At the end of the day, the town paid JHA just under $393,000 for the police work and just over $61,000 for the fire work. There are issues that arose throughout construction that we're going to talk about a little bit later. But we've had to finish the project first, which we did in May of 2019. The select board began discussing its legal options in September of last year. And over a year later, in late October of 2020, we reached a mediated settlement with JHA Architects for the issues that we had. And the town spent just over $31,000 on that endeavor between legal fees, construction experts, and the cost of mediation. And then the last outside entity that we hired was the actual contractor. The town opened bids in March of 2017, received 8 bids for the project, and award the contract to the lowest qualified bidder, which is BC Construction. And you can see the amounts on the screen. The MECC contract was paid directly by them using the state funds I've talked about earlier. So at this point, I've covered a lot of ground on the people that we hired, and I'd be happy to take any questions or, as mentioned, hold them till the end if anyone has any.
Thanks, Blythe. If anybody has any questions on any of the content that we've covered up until this point, please use the raise hand function. If you're having trouble finding that raise hand function, feel free to wave furiously at your camera or something of that nature, and we'll know to call on you. Mr. Denver, go right ahead, sir. If you could just state your name and your address.
Paul Denver from 16 Winterberry. Hope everyone can hear me. Regarding the architect, I'm not clear about what resolution we had with the architect as a result of the mediation. We hear that there were $31,000 in contract costs. Apparently the original contract called for payment of about $800,000 for both the fire and police to the architect, and they were actually paid about $450,000, I gather. But it appears from a document that Blythe prepared in May of 2019, which I have, that the architect was largely responsible for significant costs in this project. And I'd like to know what was the basis of the settlement, how much money came to the town. Blythe states in the document that the architect specs were not actually as accurate as they should have been or could have been, and that resulted in much more work than otherwise would have been required. And then she says the complexities of the effort were not anticipated. The effort to build a combined police station and state regional dispatch center were not fully appreciated by the architect and resulted in challenges that needed to be addressed. My understanding that there were problems at the site that the architect had been unaware of, and they cost a substantial amount of money to resolve. In addition, and I don't know who was responsible for this, there was no provision for preparation of the site. And the site work required that the town pay about $800,000, I understand, to resolve. And I don't know who was fully responsible for that, but apparently it wasn't contained in any original contract. And I don't want to make this too complex, but the other issue is that the project manager was actually hired, as far as I know, by MECC in 2012 and hired to do the dispatch center only. And the town of Norfolk was heavily involved in that. And then apparently there was a separate contract involved between the town and JHA, different from the contract that MECC entered into with the architects. I don't understand that. Maybe someone can explain that and what the contract was between Norfolk and JHA that was different from the contract with MECC, if it was different at all.
All right, thank you, Mr. Denver. I'm going to try to split that up into 3 distinct parts. So we have a question related to the outcome of mediation with the architect, We have a question related to the connection between the town and the architect versus the MECC and the architect. And then we had the issue related the site work component, why that wasn't included and there was an extra cost incurred. So Blythe, do you want to touch on the points that we can before we toss it over to Peter for the legal outcome?
Sure. So taking the site work first, I have a slide on that a little bit later. And so we'll cover, I think we can best cover that then. As far as contracts with the MECC and contracts with the town, I think it's important to understand that there are two entities that ended up in one building. And so, and they were on different timeframes for a while. So while the MECC in some ways got going a little bit sooner than the town, they had their own funding source in the almost over $4 million that they received from the state. So they were selecting people doing work directly for them. And then the town was selecting people to do work directly for the town. So JHA had a contract with the town and with the MECC, and the same with CDR McGuire. And I think it would be best to, I think Peter is best able to answer the legal questions that were raised.
Sure, I'm happy to, Mr. Denver. Very good questions. I think maybe the first thing to point out with respect to the settlement sum, and I think the point to emphasize first and foremost is that the town recovered that amount without actually litigating the case, which is a critical point. Courts are facing at the moment a historical backlog. I mean, you're looking at years to fully adjudicate a case, particularly a case involving, technical construction issues that don't, candidly lend themselves well to preliminary disposition that you might find in like a summary judgment motion process, for example. To litigate a case from stem to stern, you're talking years and many potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's very, very a very expensive proposition, from motion practice to discovery, requests and responses to day-to-day communications with opposing counsel and internally, depositions, trial preparations. Those are just a handful of items that really only scratch the surface and are extremely expensive, particularly in this context. I personally think it was an excellent outcome for the town. You actually, I think, well articulated some of our key arguments. They had their position, and is invariably the case. That's what litigation is. It's you have facts, but it has their own version of the facts and their own spin on the facts, and that's the reality. It's not about necessarily the facts, but what they mean. Was something reasonable? It's more nuanced than might meet the eye. I will say we mediated before a decorated and very highly esteemed former judge who heard both sides, and obviously the mediation process is by law confidential. So there's only so far we can go in terms of getting into the particulars of that. But I will say this. I want to emphasize this. Whatever your perspective is on the outcome and the town's ultimate recovery, I think it was a good one. You could call me biased, obviously. I played a key role in the negotiation of it. Whatever your perspective is on it, look no further than me. I will, everyone with whom I worked on the town side in that process just did an absolutely excellent job, from the select board to Blythe and Matt and others, and did everything I asked of them and did it extremely well. So I guess that's how I would sum up my perspective on that process.
Peter?
Yes.
In terms of, I understand that a lot of it is stuff that you can't discuss. You can, however, can you discuss who the neutral was? Because I don't know if you're aware, but Mr. Denver, and I'm sure others, are civil litigators in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And so would probably appreciate, if it's possible, knowing, because as you know, I think the world of her, and her reputation precedes her. So that might be helpful, if we're allowed to say.
Yeah, I don't see a problem with it, Ms. Van Tyne. It was Judge Delvecchio, Suzanne Delvecchio from CMCI, Commonwealth Mediation. Was very well known, highly regarded, and used, throughout the Commonwealth on complex cases.
Peter, one component of Mr. Denver's question was associated to the original claim by the architect versus what was the settlement amount came out to be. Do you happen just to have the outline of the original claim against what the final settlement was? Because I think that he had cited an amount that wasn't familiar to me of $31,000 in there.
Yeah, and I wasn't, I didn't follow that precisely, Chair Calcutt. I think were you referring, Mr. Denver, or perhaps, I don't want to speak for you, but maybe to the amount that Blythe cited, approximately $32,000 that the town incurred in connection with the mediation process between fees paid to our firm, fees paid to the expert witness, and fees paid to the mediator.
That's what I meant.
Yeah, right.
May I speak?
Sure.
Okay. I was muted. I understood, maybe I misunderstood this, that yes, those were our costs. And I thought that we had recovered those costs in the mediation. What was the result of the mediation in terms of money from one party to the other? Surely we can know what the settlement was as a result of the mediation. And I don't have that figure, and I don't think I've heard it.
I'm sorry.
Maybe we did hear it and I missed it.
Yeah, it's actually, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. It's the last bullet on this slide that appears on the screen. It was 95,000.
Okay, so we have a substantial amount of damages, I would say, from the whole constellation of matters. And I understand that the architect might not be responsible for all of them, but the architect, it seems to me, based on Blythe's statement, was responsible for substantial costs that we incurred. We're left now with a substantial deficit that we have no other party to look to. We had the project manager, we had the architect, and we've apparently resolved the claims against both of them for what appears to be relatively short money, and that may be a loaded statement. And I understand the need to mediate cases once in a while, and I've done many of them, and to compromise. I recognize that, but it seems to me that we had an opportunity perhaps to recover a substantially greater amount of our, frankly, damages if we had pursued litigation. Mediation is a great thing if you can work to a compromise that makes some sense. But we're left in a position where we have a couple of $1 million in damages, and we have no party to look to. Are we to understand that those damages are largely the result of the behavior of Norfolk employees and the building committee, or that somehow they were completely unavoidable? I don't quite understand that. And one of I've mentioned two of the elements. That is that the drawings were not particularly accurate, apparently, from the architect, and then we had this $800,000 site work bill, and frankly, I don't know who's responsible for that. And then we have the third issue that Blythe also mentions, that not all the complexities of the effort were fully anticipated by the architect and resulted in challenges that needed to be addressed. And so the architect seems to me to be on the hook for many of these costs. And now we've resolved the case for what is, I think, a fairly small amount of our overage, and we have no other party to look to. And I just don't quite understand the resolution of the case with the cases with the project manager and with the architect. I don't understand why those settlements were entered into.
Sure. Well, I first of all, totally respect your opinion. I will say, it's, having the benefit of being closer to it, respectfully, it's more nuanced than that. We're dealing with project manuals that are comprised of thousands of pages. What you've heard is our position. Like I said, they have their side. It's very, very difficult. Any practitioner will tell you in this realm, it's extremely difficult to recover against designers because the issues are so nuanced and fact intensive and in all candor, very expensive to litigate for those reasons. They're disputes of fact that almost invariably are not decided at summary judgment, at least not fully. Traditionally design firms are very resistant to incurring any liability. Their profit margins on projects like these don't really, or I guess, incentivize them, let's say, to litigate because it's just non-economic to pay out. So they tend to be very protracted, sort of arduous cases. And like I said, I mean, we're dealing with a backlog that, like everything else this year is unprecedented. Years of litigation has a cost. And I think the other key point to bear in mind here is that, it's kind of, I don't know, if anyone who's familiar with how sewer pipes work, there's a concept called infiltration and inflow that, can't be eliminated. It's basically leakage and it just can't be eliminated. It can be reduced. You can take measures to try to reduce it to the maximum possible extent, but it cannot be, it's basically impossible to eliminate it. I would say the same is true with respect to errors and omissions and costs associated with errors and omissions. It's almost a built-in cost. You have your construction cost, but then you have to assume that a certain percentage, in addition to that, is going to be incurred by virtue of errors and omissions from project design plans and specifications. It's just a reality of life. So, to some extent, it's easy to look at this in a vacuum and take our position. And certainly, I feel like we advocated zealously, as we always do, for the town's position, and identified our key arguments, our strongest arguments, and pushed them. And like I said, everyone on the town side was just tremendous to work with on it. But there's sort of the reality of litigation. I think you have to bear that in mind. And like I said, the concept of recovering anything, especially that amount close to six figures against a design firm that, statistically would have had a probably a smaller profit margin on the project, is to me a good outcome. It's an excellent outcome.
Thank you, Peter. Cece, I think you wanted to add something as well.
So again, I'm mindful that I'm not actually entirely sure what we are and aren't allowed to say, but I think I can say this without putting too fine a point on it. And I think it's something that the litigators in the group actually know. And so I appreciate asking the question in order to sort of get to the bottom of everything. But by the same token, I think that I wouldn't want anyone to be intellectually disingenuous in their incredulity about the settlement, not recognizing or refusing or failing to recognize or accept that if we were to say, thanks, Judge Delvecchio, notwithstanding your learned opinion after, 30, 40 years in this line of work, we're going to take our chances with civil litigation because we've got nothing but money to litigate, right? Like attorney's fees, Attorney Mello is sort of very delicately and articulately opining at the sort of the cost of litigation in a roundabout way. And I just want to say more forthrightly that it would be hundreds of thousands of dollars of legal fees to chase hundreds of thousands of dollars of damage with no guarantee at the outcome. And we'd be sitting here with the same group. And that's not why we wouldn't pursue it, but it's reality that we would then be sitting here presented with people who say, well, why didn't you settle for less? Why did you go to trial to the tune of $250,000? And the jury returned a verdict saying, no, thank you. That exposure is one of the things that, as everybody who litigates, including the people on this Zoom call, know, your exposure includes the time and the cost of litigation. And so I'm only speaking to that piece of it. I'm not discounting the rest of the questions that I heard, because I heard multiple questions within that, within Mr. Denver's comment. But I think that when everybody's around their collective water coolers muttering about the decision to accept $95,000, I would hope that someone would remind them, don't forget, if it was to be litigated, every time we wanted to have a question answered, we would not be able to. It would take years to get through the process, and it would take hundreds of thousands of dollars, and there is no guarantee. As long as we all accept that that's the reality, which we decided as the elected body wasn't worth it.
Thank you, Cece. Mr. Denver, that was two answers to two of your questions. The other one, as it related to the site work, I believe we're going to cover in a future slide, Blythe. Is that correct? So that being said, sir, did we address everything at the moment that you had for us?
I just want to say that, I have mediated with Judge Delvecchio. I've mediated many cases. I understand the costs of litigation are a major issue in accepting a settlement offer at mediation. But it is also important to raise the issue of the strength of the case and the amount of the damages as elements of any settlement. And it seems to me that our damages here have been very substantial. And it's not entirely clear that they're all due to the behavior of the architect or the project manager, but those two entities were primarily responsible for what happened on this project. And for us to have a settlement that returned less than $100,000 to the town when we had many hundreds of thousands of dollars, in fact, over $2 million in damages, arguably, I have a problem with that, and we can't litigate the case here. But I think that you also have to stick to your guns sometimes in mediation and say and walk away. But that's the end of my comments about that. Sorry.
And I'll just add, I respectfully, like I said, I appreciate the questions and well thought out and good questions. That math that you just recited, that ratio is, I would say categorically inaccurate based on my understanding of the case. There wasn't, it's not like a $95,000 settlement versus $2 million in damages. I candidly, that's an absurd, ratio. But I respect the comments and happy to move forward and address any other additional questions on it.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Mr. Denver. Blythe, we do have two more questions in the queue. The next one up is Mr. Haddad. Go ahead, sir, if you just state your name and address.
Ed Haddad, 138 Red Maple Run. I guess just to follow up exactly on what Attorney Mello just his comment, are you able to tell us exactly what we went into mediation looking for? I mean, to your point, if it's not $2 million and we settled for 95, what did we go in trying to get and then ultimately settled for 95? I don't know if you're able to tell us that.
Yeah, and thank you, Mr. Haddad. And again, I don't want to be evasive, but it's a confidential process. And I will say that, I don't want to give a roadmap to future potential adversaries out there, but but although I don't think I'm alone in this regard, I advocate zealously and I identify what I think our damages are, and I figure out a way to amplify them and go beyond that. So I'm not sure if I did tell you what we went into mediation looking for would necessarily be reflective of what we might reasonably have expected. I guess I'm disinclined to get into those types of particulars, given that we have to be mindful of the mediation process, which is legally confidential. It was obviously higher than 95. That's part of the process.
Right.
You have a number, they have a number, and then you meet somewhere along the continuum in between.
Right. Kevin, I had a second part of question, if you don't mind. As long as
Go right
my
ahead.
mic is still on. Blythe, could you clarify something? When you spoke about the OPM, after we went through the 3 OPMs from CDR McGuire, we went to a town OPM. So who exactly was our OPM? You said that Bullock had the only qualifications to be OPM, but Hafner was the OPM, or did I not hear that correctly? So could you clarify that, please?
I think you heard it correctly. So after the town terminated CDR, did make efforts to find someone outside of the town organization to be that person, and that was not successful. They then looked at their qualifications for an OPM and determined that Mr. Bullock held them and he could simply provide direction to Mr. Hafner. So I guess my answer would be that Mr. Hafner was the OPM with guidance from the person who had the relevant experience.
So is that an allowable position, that someone who is not qualified, at least based on state guidelines? I mean, he could.
I'm not an expert in the OPM law. I think the town was faced with a difficult situation at the time. They couldn't find someone else to do it. They had a budget. They're challenged with a budget at that point. And Mr. Hafner has, on his own experience in construction, is certainly experienced in facilities, and had someone who had more experience to rely on if he had any questions. From every account I've heard throughout the organization, he did a tremendous job, got the project done, and fought vociferously for every dollar for the community. Probably, and I know, having worked with Matt for a year and a half, I'm guessing he worked harder for the town than any outside consultant would have. So.
And again, I have nothing against Mr. Hafner. I don't even know him, to be honest with you. I don't know his work, to be honest with you. I'm just trying to clarify the point that you had made, that's all.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Haddad. I did see that we had one other question that has disappeared. I believe it was Mr. Rand. Mr. Rand, do you still have a question, or was it addressed in the course of the previous responses?
That was touched on by Paul Denver towards the end of what he said, so I put my hand down, but thank you for calling on me.
Thank you, sir. I am not seeing any further questions at this time, Blythe, so please feel free to proceed.
So there were challenges, and we've already touched on some of them tonight through some of the comments, and I don't disagree with any of them. So here are ones that we wanted to make sure we pointed out to the community. To start with, the OPM team was chosen. They replaced staff. We had performance issues. We had to terminate them. It was our decision to do that and replace them with town staff. That was a challenge. We formed opinions about the work of the architect, as you've also heard, from incomplete drawings with flaws to not adhering to the contract terms and standard of care. The town actually had negotiated a very strong contract with regard to standard of care in terms of how the architect was to approach it, how long it took to answer requests for information, review drawings. Those took a long time throughout the whole project, and actually added to the time it took to complete the project. That was another issue. And then there were numerous conflicts between the actual building conditions of the property we bought and the drawings that were resulted from there. Further challenges included the fact that the building that we bought, the documents that we received for that were not accurate. and the architect and our consultants didn't take as much time as we believe they should have to check and verify the information. You know, I would say that these are our opinions. I would expect if these consultants reviewed this slide, they might have different opinions about all that, and that certainly is understandable, but these are ours. Secondly, we were advised by both the architect and the owner's project manager, as I understand it, that we could lower the overall budget to $300,000 for the site work and self-perform that work. The $300,000 would simply be the amount of money we needed to purchase any of the materials or supplies that we need to do the site work. Reviewing the minutes and notes of the project back through that time, I can tell you that the committee was challenged with trying to bring the project into their budget. And when they were given this information, they utilized it as a way to bring the project back into what they thought was in line with the budget. And it didn't work out that way. Before the project went out to bid, the owner's project manager and town staff had a chance to review all the drawings and specifications and came up with a list of issues that they thought needed to be resolved so that when it went out to bid, those documents were as complete and correct as they could be. My understanding was the committee decided to go out to bid anyway, even though they didn't give them the time to make those changes. And that led to conflicts, issues throughout construction, and change orders, another issue that we had. As I mentioned earlier, the coordination between the parties and the architect's responses to things like shop drawings and requests for information took a very long time. It added 8 months to the overall project. The project was supposed to take a year. It took longer than that. And the contractor, who's not at fault for these sorts of things, was due to be paid for each month of general conditions beyond what he was contracted for. That led to an additional $340,000. And then finally, the building committee was advised they could remove the technology needed from the bid specifications and bid them out themselves. They did that, but having two different entities responsible and the coordination involved caused issues and costs associated with that as well. I will make a note, though, that when we look at the overall budget, you'll see that the technology budget is overspent, looks to be overspent. There were some things purchased for this building that also actually support the fire station today. So I'll go into those a little bit later. And then there's the roof. So this has caused a lot of questions over a couple of years. So the existing roof on the building was not terribly well constructed. And so the building committee made a business decision because it didn't meet energy standards and building code, being 10 years old, that it would be preferable to replace it with a roof that would last much longer, not wanting to have to come back to the town in a maybe 10 or 15 years and replace it when, from the community's perspective, we just built it. So the issue with the bid was that following Chapter 149, bids have to be structured very specifically into what's called filed sub-bids and a general bid. This project was not, in our opinion, described accurately in those bid documents. And so it became an issue because the general contractor claimed he wasn't carrying the cost for the roof in his bid. And with input from the state, there's people in the correct state agency who can opine on these things. They determined that and advised us that it was done incorrectly. So there we were with a situation where the roof still needed to be paid for. We mediated with the contractor over that amount, and it ended up being $368,000. So I'd like to talk about the site work that was questioned earlier. So site work on this project includes, but isn't limited to, drainage, utilities, the parking lot, and lighting. As I mentioned, the original estimate from the architect was about $1 million, but the town was looking for ways to reduce the cost, and the idea was seized upon to just budget the materials and have the work self-performed by DPW. And the reality was quite different. The town, in order to start the work, was going to hire DPW to do some of it, but they don't have the necessary equipment or the staffing, being the highway division is 5 people for all of the town work. They also were going to hire people directly for the project. They actually did, but determined they needed to be paid at prevailing wage, which was higher than expected and certainly higher than the DPW staff would have made. The work also was more extensive than described, and the final site work cost was just over $1 million, or fairly close to what was originally suggested. So one might wonder, well, why not just stop the project? Things are not going well. Let's try to figure out what's going on, get it corrected or got under control, and before it gets any worse. Well, there's a couple of reasons for not stopping. Chapter 149, as I mentioned, gave the contractor a certain amount of time to finish the job. If the town decided to stop the job, we would have been responsible for paying the contractor for demobilizing from the project, mobilizing back again, probably some others that I know Mr. Hafner can explain if that's needed. And that would have not necessarily saved any money. Also, it's important to understand at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, the state had given the MECC $4 million, and they had an expectation this project was going to get done. It's already gone on longer than they expected, and that's caused issues. So there was pressure to keep moving forward. And then finally, all 4 towns had to continue to operate their dispatch centers at a cost, even though they had planned to close those, eliminate that staff, and take part with the MECC. They'd actually already started to pay some of the cost of operating the MECC. So there was pressure there as well. So I've covered a lot with regard to construction and some of these issues. I'd be happy to stop at this point if anyone has any questions.
Thank you, Blythe. If anybody has any questions related to any of the content that we've covered up to this point, please use the raise hand function at this time. Mr. Denver, I see your hand up. Go right ahead, sir.
Yeah, I don't want to revisit the comments I've already made, but Blythe just commented about a couple of elements of substantial cost. And I want to ask a couple of questions about it. One is the $340,000 caused by delays and change orders resulting in delays. And in her statement of May of 2019, she said, in part, unfortunately, in this case, became clear over time that the architectural drawings were not as thorough and complete as they should have been. And this resulted in both change orders for contractors for more work, et cetera, et cetera. And then says, while the town ultimately may have to pay for the work, missing the time delay caused the contractor to be paid for 8 additional months at $342,000. That seems to me to be a problem essentially on the architect. I'd like to see somebody opine on that. And the second element has to do with the roof work. And she made a comment in this paper that she wrote that the roofing work should have been put out to bid, and I think she mentioned that just now, as separate filed sub-bid, and it was not. And I'd like to find out who was responsible for ensuring that it was put out to bid as a separate filed sub-bid under the law, apparently, and who didn't do that. I mean, I'm not looking necessarily for the person who's responsible in every case, but we have to have accountability. Can we answer those questions? It's cost $369,000 apparently for the change order for the roof work.
So let me take the roof first. The The roof work was included in the bid specifications by the architect. And if we were building a brand new building, it's my understanding that the way it was specified would have been correct. But in this sense, in this case, we were renovating an existing building. And so that caused the way the project was described in the bid to be done differently. That's the simplest way that I can tell you about that, unless we want to have Matt explain the filed sub-bid process, and that's pretty complicated. But in its essence, it wasn't included correctly, and that was the determination by the state. Unfortunately, in these situations, whether it was covered correctly or not, the town expected to build a roof, it still ends up having to pay for it. And so that's why we had to add back into the project the cost of the roof. And I'm sorry, I need you to just remind me of your first question.
Your comments in May of 2019 indicated that the architectural drawings are not as thorough and complete as they should have been.
Thank you. Thank you.
That resulted in change orders and delays. And the cost was apparently $342,000.
I know that Mr. Hafner can give one or two examples of that if that's helpful, but overall, if the architect had taken extra time to review shop drawings or had given a general scope of what should have been built, but the subcontractor had to submit a specific detail and took time to do that, or there were coordination issues about those things, that all took time. That was not the fault of the contractor. So if it took more time for all those things to happen, and then he needed the time to actually do the work, that created time delays and then cost for the prevailing wages, for the general conditions over the extra 8 months. I hope that's helpful.
If I could just add to that, but I think it's, I'm I guess inclined to just underscore that delay analysis is a very technical and complicated exercise. It's something that's the subject of a very specialized area of construction expertise. I'm not sure how scientific the methodology was through which that number was identified. If that was a sort of a preliminary sense, I'm not sure how vetted it was. So I don't want necessarily, I wouldn't want people to glom onto that number, as if that's, etched in stone. And I will say, with respect to the change order associated with the roof, the natural rebuttal to, it is true that resulted in a change order of, $300,000 plus, but the natural rebuttal, of course, is that the town received a roof. So, one of the elements you need to establish is harm. And the reality is the town received, it paid for what it received is the rebuttal argument. So it's an example of one of the nuanced issues that you confront in litigating a case. Even though something on its surface might seem relatively straightforward, when you peel it back and are immersed in a litigation, there's more than meets the eye. So I just wanted to flag those 2 points.
Mr. Denver, were the couple of questions that you had posed and those addressed?
Yeah, yep, very good. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question. Mr. Haddad, go right ahead, sir.
Ed Haddad, 138 Red Maple Run. I guess after all these problems that the committee incurred was encountering and the cost going up, I guess the question I have, was this ever brought back to town meeting to the voters who had approved the original override for the 14 million for both projects? And now obviously the fire station was in jeopardy. Did this ever come back to town meeting?
I'll have to rely on others to answer that, Mr. Haddad, but I maybe there were reports to town meeting, but there was no action for town meeting to actually take. But perhaps others who have been here longer than I might know that answer.
Excuse me, Matt Hafner. There was a update given by the committee chair at a town meeting. I forget which year it was, but there was describing that there were some issues going on. So yes, there was an update.
Well, I guess, was the taxpayers aware of the cost overruns? So issues and costs are two different things.
It's a little hard for me to answer that, not having been here. I
I'm
would,
asking to Matt since he knew of the
Sorry.
presentation. Sorry.
I'm not,
Lloyd.
Mr. Haddad, I'm not positive the verbiage was spoken at that time, but there was discussed at a town meeting that we were having some difficulties and that we were trying to solve them. I don't know if dollar amounts were given, but there was an update given to the townspeople, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Haddad. We do have one more question. It just says Anne Marie. Ms. Battistone, is that you? Anne Marie, the floor is yours. You are on mute.
Okay. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Go right ahead, ma'am.
Yeah. Why were the duties of the OPM, why did that fall to Matt Heffner if Bob Bullock was available with all the credentials?
my assumption is that Mr. Bullock also, he was not a voting member of the committee, but he also had a role to play as the building commissioner in inspecting the building. So it wouldn't have been appropriate for him to both be the inspector and be managing the job. So that's my understanding of how that was decided.
Okay.
Anne Marie, did that answer your question?
Well, I guess so.
Okay. Thank you.
I would seem to me, I mean, it just seems illogical that he couldn't have done both of those. I don't really quite understand that, but, and what's done is done, but it seems as if, you know, there's all this talk about who had the credentials and who didn't. And it would seem to me that somehow Bob should have been the one that stepped up and not have it fall to Matt. That's all.
Understood. Thank you.
Yep.
Do we have any other questions before we move on? If there are, please either raise your hand or wave at your camera. Mr. Rand, go right ahead, sir.
Howard Rand, 101 Red Maple Run. Just a question to Mr. Mora, of course, just to revisit. In $93,000 settlement, how much money was asked for in the addendum clause originally when we started the litigation against the defendant?
Thank you, Mr. Rand. By the way, I should clarify. It says Mara on my screen. I'm using my wife's computer. Her name's Mara, so that's why that.
I'm sorry.
No. I didn't want any confusion.
Well, I said Mr. Mara, so maybe that's pertinent. So
it actually, you're totally on with that. Actually, that's you're on the money with that. So yeah, just to clarify, to be clear, we didn't commence a litigation. There was no complaint or pleading in which we recited a damages amount or anything. This was the $95,000 settlement was recovered after a mediation process, which, as I mentioned, is a confidential process. There was never any, public document that we file with the court, for example, that recited our alleged damages.
yeah, and did we counterclaim against the project manager at all? I think they were the ones that initiated it, the litigation or the.
Oh, so you're referring to the prior litigation
yeah.
from CDR McGuire that was brought against MECC a few years ago. That obviously preceded me. In that case, actually, CDR McGuire invoked the mediation process that was contained in the contract between the town and CDR McGuire. They didn't actually litigate that case. There was never a pleading filed or an action commenced against the town of Norfolk in connection with that dispute. That was mediated. So there wasn't a claim or a counterclaim or anything. That was a mediation process as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rand. Do we have any other questions before we move on? I am seeing none at this time, so please proceed, Blythe.
So let's get to the dollars. Here on the screen is a true up for the project between what the police station was supposed to cost and what it actually cost by major area. The original was just under $8.6 million with all costs included. The actual $10,664,000 and some change, for a difference of just over $2,074,000. I would point out that the line item for other costs does include some various items that are attributable to both police and fire. And the example I would give is that we need to go out and borrow the money and go and spend some dollars to go through that process that will ultimately benefit both projects. So it's not exactly just the police station. But primarily, you can see the top line, the construction, that the $6,731,172 is the actual final cost to BC construction, land purchase, the site work. You can see the difference I've explained in a prior slide, and the technology budget's the other one that I would point out, issues that arose there, but would also tell everyone that there were several items bought that will ultimately do now and will in the future support the fire station, including a new telephone system that coordinates with the MECC, a recorder, and a few other things. So overall, it's a $2 million difference. And so I think this slide is a little bit repetitive, but I wanted to give people a sense of the larger change orders. This is by no means the total list, but here you see at the top, the roof, the general conditions we've spoken of. The site work here of $303,000, I want to just spend a second on that. And the reason I do is because as I told you earlier, the total site work cost was $1,056,000. And the town did attempt to self-perform, if you will, most of that work. We hired 2 people to do work directly. We rented equipment and things like that. After some of that effort determined that it was important to have some of it coordinated with the contractor. And so this was $303,000 was the amount actually paid to BC Construction. There was additional money spent on winter conditions. It took longer to do the project. Contractors are allowed to charge for temporary heat and those sorts of things. That in addition. And then there were issues with the concrete slab. There's an additional cost of almost $29,000 for that work as well. It occurred to all of us putting the presentation together that it would be helpful to kind of look at this in comparison to other projects in our area. And so we have a slide here for you that shows you other police and fire stations in our general area and in the last 4 years, Medfield, Millis, Westwood, Walpole, and Mansfield, and of course, Norfolk. Please understand that these are not, these are per square foot costs based on the total price, square feet of each building. I understand that some of these other buildings are of different construction than the metal building that we have. So that is one thing to point out. I'd also point out that all of these projects were building only. They all had the land or were given the land to build these buildings. So even though we had overruns and things that didn't go well, land and building together, our project was $534 a square foot. And if you take out the land, the building only was $481. So I think it's important to review again some of the decision points that led to where we are today. And after that, some insights into future projects, because I think there's been things learned here to make whatever project the town does next go much better than this one did in some regards. I think a very critical point is the decision by the, I assume, then select board to become part of the MECC. Well, I think it was a good decision in many ways. It definitely changed the course of this project. If we had been successful in 2009 and the project had passed at the ballot box, perhaps we would have built it for the $10 million at the time that was thought to be the correct amount. But the state prefers to fund dispatch centers as part of public safety buildings. They don't like to have them be standalone projects. The town needed both a police and fire station, but police station, it was determined by the board, could be at a location on a side of town, not necessarily in the center. And they made that choice and decided to put the two together. That changed the course of the project. As we said before, in our opinion, the architect delivered inadequate plans and specs with deficiencies, and they weren't corrected before going out to bid. If they'd been corrected before going out to bid, then they would have likely we still would have paid for the work, whatever it would have been, but we would have avoided costly change orders. I think that is very important. I also think it's important that for whatever reason, the building committee and the select board at the time decided to go to the voters in December of 2015 for the $12.2 million to finish building the project when they hadn't finished design. I've done public safety projects in other communities, libraries and others, and I find it surprising that they would, without knowing the full final design and perhaps the costs, they knew the right number to ask town meeting to pay for. I think that was an issue. As I mentioned, we felt that we followed inaccurate advice to do that site work, and that cost more than was planned, the extra 8 months. I think all these things together at the end of the day, $14 million was not likely a sufficient amount to build two separate buildings. When you build two separate buildings, in some cases, you've got twice the cost, hiring two contractors, mobilizing twice, and so on. I think the number was always going to be higher. And for whatever reason, that was determined to be the price that we would ask town meeting to fund. So what would we do differently in the future? I think it's important to recruit a building committee that's got experience in the types of disciplines that are involved in a project like this. Architects, engineers, facility directors, those sorts of things, who can help advise on a project like this, or at least question the consultants and challenge them. Also, then they need to be educated in the various state laws that we've covered, because they're different than the typical process in the private sector. Develop a very carefully vetted budget, and then vet it again and keep doing it till you get it straight. Make sure that you take the time to review and correct bid documents before you go out to bid, because they do add change orders and cost. But even before that, hire third-party consultants who are not aligned at all with any of the consultants to review bid specs and validate the documents, and then have outside cost estimators review the costs and give you their opinion based on the current market, and do those at a couple of different points. I think if you do take steps like this, you can be a lot more confident that the money that you need, you're correct about. And then consider alternatives to the Chapter 149 process. There is a process called construction manager at risk, in which you hire a contractor and you negotiate a price for the whole project. And then if they can't deliver it within that price, that's their problem, not the town's. It can work. It's been used successfully before. Or alternatively, just change the timing. Come to town meeting with a bid in hand, so our residents can be more confident that you know exactly what you need, because you've already opened the bids and you have those prices at the ready. And then finally, keep the community updated regularly through the website, through meetings, whatever, just so people don't find out afterwards what didn't go well. So fire stations next, hopefully on the docket, and we have to think about how to go about that. So wanted to help everyone understand, well, what do we have, what's left, and how do we move forward? So
Blake, do you think that now would be a good time to break for questions related to the wrap up or the follow-up items from the police station?
Of course, thank you.
Thanks, Blake. So this time we'll open it up for anybody who has any questions related to the learnings or outcomes or insights for the future related to the project. If you do have any questions, please use the raise hand function at this time. I do see 2 questions in the queue, 1 question in the queue. Anne-Marie, go right ahead. Anne-Marie, I believe you're on mute.
Okay, I'm sorry. I think this was mentioned earlier, but I must have missed it. Who advised the town to do the site work itself?
It's my understanding that the architect and the owner's project manager.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Mr. Rosenberg, go right ahead, sir.
On the bullet item, it says hire third-party consultants. I guess my question is what percentage of the budget would you consider the maximum that you'd pay for the third-party consultants? I could see, since you said do it multiple times, I could see the third-party consultants possibly duplicating the work of the architect, and I could see that running up, a fee close to the fee that we're paying the architect. So I guess I'm looking for some idea of the amount that you'd be willing to put into the third-party consultants.
So you would hire 2 different consultants, one to do the third-party review of the specifications themselves, and I think you would probably only do that once closer to the end of design. But the outside cost estimate, that could be done at each natural break in construction at the end of, say, design development and the end of construction documents. I've been a part of this before, but I just don't have at the ready what these things tend to cost. We can get back to you about that. I don't think it would cost nearly what we paid the architect at all. And I can appreciate why seems rather frustrating to pay experts than pay experts to look at their work. But unfortunately, I think it's an important double and triple check to make sure that the project's on track. Thank you.
Thank you, Blake. Mr. Rosenberg, did that address your inquiry?
Let's see, am I muted? Yes, that does address it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Diamond, you're next. Go right ahead, sir.
Sure. I got a couple questions. When did spending actually end on the whole project?
So other than the recent legal expenses, the expenses really ended sometime probably early fall of 2019. Though Matt would know better, he is responsible for closeout. He may have a different answer.
But wasn't there some other additional work back at the fire station, mold or some other issues? Looking into some other existing issues there?
We did look at, we did have an air quality test done at the fire station, but I'm sorry, I don't recall the source of funds to do that work.
Okay. Is there a full list of all the approved change orders? And is there then some total that accounts for all the elective stuff in terms of amenities or niceties or that kind of stuff, elective stuff?
So of course, our finance department can provide a report from our accounting system of every expense for the project. we provided the one-page summary because it just seemed easier to digest. But there is more detail that is available.
Is there a ballpark on the amenities piece of it, or?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by amenities. Maybe if you could be more specific, maybe myself or Mr. Hafner can answer.
Wasn't there stuff about color or stripes or the finish on the front versus the back, or?
I'm not being here. I'm sorry, I'm probably not the best one to answer that question. Mr. Hafner, is that something you can answer?
Sure. We had the stripe on the front was the CMU finish, which was a split face concrete block. That was originally specified to be painted blue. We actually, to save funds, because we were concerned about funds, we had that written out of the scope of the work, and we kept it natural.
I'll just seat it all up the middle.
The front and the back was strictly just insulated panels, and the majority of the front and both sides of the building were insulated panels as well, except actually majority of it. There's a split face veneer on part of the street side, but niceties, there really wasn't niceties that I'm aware of, anything extra. It was pretty basic building.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Next, we have Mr. Haddad. Go right ahead, sir.
This is like the question on process. You might need Matt to help you with this, but on a change order, who signs off on the change order to approve it? And then is there a financial sign off on the change order? You're on mute, Blake.
Yep, just got that. So generally the architect would sign off on it, the contractor would sign off on it, and the owner, in this case, I would assume it was somebody on behalf of the building committee, but I would defer to Matt if there's a more specific answer.
That is an accurate recap.
Is there a financial sign off?
There's an AIA document contract, which breaks it out, which goes to the architect first. The architect signs it, then it goes under his advice to the town to pay.
So there's no financial sign off.
Once we receive the approved change order on the AIA document, the committee would vote on those. So the committee would approve them.
So there's no financial sign off.
Well, I think in this case, the building committee was the responsible for the budget as well. So I would say the answer to that question is the committee as a whole.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Our next question is from Mr. Rand. Go right ahead, sir.
Hi. Insights for future projects, which is currently on the screen. I presume that that's inclusive of the school project and the firehouse project as well. Am I correct?
So if I'll answer that in two parts. I mean, generally I would say yes, but I would also tell you that if the town is successful in its attempt to enter the state's the Massachusetts School Building Authority MSBA program, they have a very rigorous and very detailed process by which they require a project to be done. And so while it might include some of these things, you must follow their process. And I'm glad you brought that up because I meant to say it sooner. The town used the MSBA process when we built the Freeman Kennedy School, and we most recently did the H. Olive Day roof. Both of those projects were MSBA funded in part. Both came in within budget. So I would say that learning from that and or taking into account some of the points on the screen will make the town much more likely to be successful in bringing a project in under budget in the future.
Okay, it doesn't pertain to the fire department, though, I presume, the firehouse.
The MSBA process does not pertain to the fire department, but certainly, that might be a good process to study in terms of making sure that the process we undertake for the fire station is rigorous enough to complete it within whatever the budget's determined to be for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rend. Our next question is Donna. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Donna Jones. Question and then a couple of comments. There had been hopes for solar to be installed over parking spaces. Was the solar eliminated for a technical, financial, or both reasons?
It's my understanding that it's actually for a completely separate reason, Donna. My understanding is that that was contemplated, but that was not approved by the planning board as part of the site plan process. So it did not move forward. I think I'd have to defer to Mr. Hafner, but if that was something that the planning board would be amenable to at this point, it could go forward in the future.
Matt, did you have something else to add to that one?
Yes, just not to correct Blythe, but we had the building designed to carry the weight of solar panels for the roof. And we did go in front of the planning board, or I did on behalf of the Public Safety Building Committee. And we did have two approved arrays, ground mount, or like they call them canopies, and on the roof. With the complexity of the project, and we elected not to try to add another complexity issue in the construction of the project, and we have just temporarily paused it. I do understand that the planning board wants us to go back and reapply, but there were initial drawings from vendors and designs, but we stopped because our focus was trying to get the building open, and just got put on the back burner while we were dealing with other litigation and everything else.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Matt. And to Blythe's point, I do believe that the planning board did have some concerns or questions related to the configuration, the look, and the design. But I don't know if that was necessarily the reason why it was eventually pulled. I think it was more to Matt's point. Donna, did you have any other questions? Oh, thank you. Our next one is Anne-Marie. Go right ahead. Anne-Marie, I think you're on mute.
I'm all set. Maybe I didn't take the hand down. I thought that was something you would do. I'm all set.
No worries, I got it. Thank you. Next we have Beth. Go right ahead, ma'am.
Yeah, hi, this is Bob Valley, Beth's husband. Can you hear me?
Sorry about that, Bob. Go right ahead.
No, that's all right. I just had a question about on the spreadsheet regarding the project. There was bonding costs to the town of $116,000. I wondered what those constituted, where that comes from.
Is this the correct slide?
Pardon?
Is this the correct slide on the screen that you're referring to?
I don't see it on there. I think it's under additional project costs. It was the spreadsheet that was on the
website.
The town website. Yeah, it would come under additional project. It was part of the other costs.
The additional project costs include things like surveying, some
Yeah, right. Yeah,
work.
it had bonding costs on there, which was almost $117,000. I wondered what bonds the town was paying for, as opposed to the contractor who's usually paying for performance and bid bonds and such.
Thank you for clarifying. No, the bonds that we're referring to are the bonds that we sold to finance the project.
Oh, okay.
Debt.
Okay, so that's a debt issue. Okay, all right.
Correct.
That's fine. Okay. In terms of the site work that was done, was there additional work that was done as part of the site work that involved any kind of hazardous material? I noticed there was a geotechnical cost in there for $16,000. Was that just part of monitoring the site work? Was there anything else that was discovered on site that had to be mediated?
I'd like to turn that question over to Mr. Hafner.
You were correct. There was, we discovered a large burial of transite pipe and other pieces of asbestos that were unearthed as we were trying to put in drainage structures and roadways. It was fairly extensive. We had no idea prior, but once you find it, you have to deal with it. We had to deal with it several times because the further we dug, we would have spots that we'd feel like we were in good, we were out of it, and we'd continue on. And then a day later, we found more. So there were several stoppages of the site work because we had to continue to deal with asbestos that was buried and unknown when we bought the building.
Yeah, was this part of the reason that the town couldn't handle the site work, or was it other issues relative to the site work that were too much for the town to handle?
Well, you have to be a qualified vendor to handle the quantities of asbestos reporting to the state. I believe that our DPW has a couple of employees that are capable of taking small quantities of asbestos, but it's a different animal when you have the quantities we found. There was lots of different issues with site work. It wasn't one or the other. It was a large site work project. So just the manpower and the tooling and the coordination were the major issues.
Yeah. How far into the project site work did you get before you realized that the town was in over its head?
Well, I don't think we were in over our head as much as we could not staff it, and we didn't have the technical expertise on a few items, but I don't think we were in over our head. We were progressing at it, but unfortunately, having two employees that I was overseeing and having a large site, which if we were working on one area and we were holding up another area for the general contractor or other contractors that need to have areas done, we didn't have the bandwidth to take it all on.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, that should have been apparent from the beginning, wasn't it? I mean, somebody said that you were advised by the OPM and the architect that the town would be able to do this work. And I'm not sure why it wouldn't be apparent up front that the town wouldn't be able to handle all this work.
I can't answer that statement.
Okay, all right. That's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Valley. Mr. Denver, go right ahead, sir.
Related to the issue that was just raised, if Mr. Hafner became the project manager at one point, I assume that he was devoting most of his time to that particular job, and he could not do the work that he had originally been hired by the town to do. So did the town simply do without his services, or did we have a replacement person to do the, I guess it's the DPW work, I'm not sure, the department. And was that an additional cost and perhaps a cause of difficulties for the town to do the rest of the work that Mr. Hafner has done for a number of years, apparently? So that's one of my questions. And then the second question, I'd go back to what Blythe said, and I really appreciate her comments about potential improvements and recommendations. She talked about getting a building committee that has applicable disciplines and educate them on state construction law. And I think she mentioned having an architect and an engineer, maybe a CPA, I'm not sure, and a lawyer. Can anybody clarify what the professional makeup was of the building committee that was in charge of the police station? Did it have any architects, engineers, CPAs, or lawyers, or do we know whether these people had any knowledge or good knowledge of state construction laws? Thanks.
So to take your second question first, I understand, I have not found that there was any specific requirements that the select board at the time had to appoint the residents that they did. I know that at least one of them was an engineer who stayed with the project for a little over half the time. But I can't give you a more explicit answer than that. With regard to Mr. Hafner, there is a assistant director who supported, but my understanding is that Mr. Hafner worked well beyond his regular work week to perform both jobs, and he was not paid any additional funds for the work he did on this project.
Thank you, Mr. Denver. Thank you, Blythe. Donna, I see that your hand is up again. Did you have another question?
Yes, please.
Go.
Couple of points, but to the most recent one, Matt, or I believe our financial director, Todd, is on the line. Matt was hired as a facilities manager, and he was doing a great job at that when he got pulled into this police station project. I believe Matt was given an additional salary. Does anyone want to confirm that?
I can confirm that I was not given additional salary. I received no additional compensation for working. So, and to answer Mr. Denver's, we worked 6 to 7 days a week, minimum of probably 80 hours a week to try to accommodate everything, all our duties. And I have a great number 2 who stepped up as well. So it was a team effort to make sure that the town's services were kept to the highest level, and we were working nonstop on the projects.
I do want to compliment Matt that I saw the extremely good work that he did under pressure, and had the team backing of building maintenance to support him. And there was an earlier question about how was the town given updates. I agree that you had to watch or attend the Public Safety Building Committee meetings, and a general summary was given at one town meeting about we've had problems, we're trying to address them, and we're over budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. So before we move on to discussing the fire station, does anybody have any other questions related to the content covered relative to the police station? I am seeing none at this time. Blythe, please proceed.
Thank you. So I wanted to recap with everyone where we stand on the project financially. At the top of this spreadsheet, you see the original budget of 14 million, less the amount for the police station, the amount spent on the initial design of the fire station, the site work for the fire station that has been done to clear the land that was bought from Federated Church, left a budget available of a little over 3,115,000. And then you add to that the settlement with the architect and the premiums and interest from the bond sale. And the funds available is $3,338,892. I think it's important to understand that back when this project was being finalized, the fire station specifically, the estimate was $4.8 million, and clearly that's a shortfall there. But based on the cost to finish this project and the other ones for the neighboring towns I mentioned earlier, I would conservatively say that we're looking at more along the lines of $8 to $10 million. And I say that with hesitation because, as I mentioned earlier, we have not fully designed this project. We don't know exactly what components it will have. And so this is a very preliminary estimate at this time. So what are the next steps? I would suggest, and this is certainly up to the select board, that, as we mentioned earlier, they recruit a building committee with relevant experience, and they give that committee a very specific charge, a very detailed outline of what they expect, when they expect it, and they in essence give them stopping points by which they need to report to the select board and get approval to move to the next step. So again, we do all we can to keep the project on track. And then they would start the project over again in terms of they need to hire an owner's project manager. Then that firm helps them hire the architect. But in this case, I would have them recommend to the select board who they think should be hired. So again, there's a check and balance. They could then develop the plans and specifications for the replacement of the station. And as I mentioned earlier, continue with regular updates to the community. A decision point would have to be taken about how far we go on this project, because clearly if there's not enough funds to complete construction, at some point have to be determined what is needed and how that would be financed. So those are the end of our presentation overall. We do have some slides about some questions that came in to us prior to the meeting, and we can go over those, Kevin, if you'd like, or take questions now.
Let's take a quick pause for anybody who has questions about the fire station outline that was just highlighted. If you do have any questions, please use the raise hand function before we get to the other questions that we had listed. Mr. Haddad, go right ahead, sir.
I guess just based on this last point, the third bullet, Blythe, that you just mentioned, my recollection is in reading the minutes of town meeting, I guess it was 2014 or 2015, I just can't recall what year when the override was approved. It was approved for a new police station and a renovation of the fire station. So that being said, does that mean that you would go back to town meeting to get a new override and a new approval for, if this is what you're talking about, a replacement fire station?
Well, I use the word replacement loosely. One of the initial designs had the town adding on a new apparatus bay, but then renovating portions of the existing building. I think it's important to have consultants help the town understand what would be the most cost-effective approach, whether it would be to demolish it and start again, or would be to try and renovate it. Generally, renovation costs more than new construction. And we certainly have just been through a process where renovation didn't go particularly well. So I think it's important to do that. I don't think that we would need to go back to town meeting and get that vote reauthorized. I think that the going back to town meeting will be for the difference between the money we have left and what we need to complete whatever is going to be done to the fire station.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Blythe. Do we have any other questions relative to the outline of the fire station project? I am seeing none at this time, Blythe, so let's go over some questions.
So some of these were actually asked during the presentation, so let me try to pick the ones that haven't been. I think the second bullet, who was responsible for project and budget compliance. I think I stated earlier, that would be the building committee. What the then select board would have required of the building committee in terms of reporting in and what to do about that, I'm afraid I can't answer, but I'm suggesting that is the answer. Who approved the valuation and the amount paid for the land? That was recommended to town meeting by the select board. Exactly how they came up with that amount prior to the full appraisal that was done after town meeting, I'm not sure. But I can say that the final amount paid was based on that appraisal. And I think the last question's already been answered about how qualifications for the committee. I'm not aware that there were any specifically. So what was the basis for deciding the police station should also include the MECC? I would suggest it would be the select board. They were the ones who were decision maker in forming the MECC with the other communities and signing those agreements with or other communities. And then they, I think, had a role with the MECC in deciding that 14 Sharon Avenue was the right location and the MECC would go on the second floor. Understanding, of course, that that's the model that the state wanted to see financed, and this location made that possible. How to finance the balance of the cost of the fire station, the remaining project costs that the funds that we have, and the likely additional debt. I think one of the things that the community is going to need to decide is the timing of that. Ideally, you don't take on new debt until you've paid off old debt, so that the impact to taxpayers is at least even, if not going down. We will need to look at the debt schedule, also knowing that Freeman Kennedy expansion will be coming at some point in the future, and figure out how to do these in a way that's cost effective for the town. And then, are there plans to create a permanent building committee? I think, as I mentioned early in the presentation, there had been one, and it was removed from the bylaws by town meeting in 2007. So I think those are all the good questions that I have for you, Kevin.
Thanks, Blythe. I think I see a hand up on camera. Paul, go right ahead, sir.
This is Paul Erickson, 79 Red Maple Run. I see that you plan to finance the fire station through remaining project funds, which is, I guess, around $3.5 million, and additional debt resources. Are we going to have to do another override, or are we going to, how are we going to do this? Increase the taxes? How are we going to fund? When you say debt, what does that mean?
So debt would either be a borrowing of funds either within the levy or a debt exclusion. When you do a debt exclusion, you only pay for the debt for the length of the time you need to finance the project. An override is quite different. It's a permanent increase in the tax rate. I would imagine the select board would not recommend an override because it's permanent. But I think, as I tried to say earlier, we need to look at the overall debt schedule and see when we are paying off some debt. So if we're paying off $3.5 million, perhaps we can borrow $3.5 million so that the overall tax impact to the resident doesn't go up.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Do we have any other questions relative to the content that we've shared, the police station recap, the fire station outlook? Mr. Diamond, I see you have your hand up. Go right ahead, sir.
Sure. What level of design had been completed on the fire station before that was put on pause?
I believe it was, I'm not sure the completed schematic design, but I would ask Mr. Hafner if he knows more specifically.
We were in schematic design phase, and some of the monies that were spent were writing the specifications for the blasting the mass rock excavation, which we had to pay for that portion of it. That's how we came up with the numbers, but we had multiple meetings with the fire department and the architect, went back and forth on designs, and but we were still in the design, schematic design phase.
And does the town own all those source files or CAD files or designs that are, is that live with the JHA, or is that the town's?
That lives with JHA, and we never really had an agreed upon design at the end of when we stopped working with JHA. So we don't have all we have are some very minimal documents.
So it's back to square zero?
I would say that was the correct assessment, yes.
And are we completely cut ties with JHA, or are they think they still working? What, they still planning on continuing on the fire station?
No,
Good.
we have completely cut ties.
Mm-hmm. That's all.
Thanks, Eric. Mr. Rand, go right ahead, sir.
Yeah. Blythe, is there any estimate or budget as to when the fire department building will start?
There is not. I think that's the select board wanted to go through this process before we start to think about that. Though I would say, if you've been to the fire station, it is in very difficult shape, and my hat is off to all of the folks who work in the department, because their only place where they can congregate when they work 24-hour shifts is in a house trailer that's in the back of the building.
I saw the facilities. It is deplorable, and I'm an ex-volunteer firefighter, so I sympathize. Wow. The other thing is we estimated $8 to $10 million. So if we don't start within the next few years, that $8 to $10 million, I would presume, would quite frankly go up.
That's quite possible. And so, yes, I think that we should move ahead, in my opinion, to form the correct committee and get going on the plan, so that we can figure out what, take a hard look at what's really needed and not more than that, and how we can effectively raise the appropriate amount of funds that the taxpayers find reasonable and fair, and not have it cost more than it needs to.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mr. Rand, just to also add to that, I mean, from the select board's perspective, I think that we've identified the importance of being able to hold this forum to be able to cover and almost turn the page on what was the MECC project, in order for us to be able to look forward to what is equally as urgent in our perspective in addressing the needs and the concerns of the fire station. So this was the first step in kind of moving forward.
I honestly think that it is past due that they do have a decent fire station, yes.
Thank you, sir. Do we have any other questions at this time? I am seeing no other questions, so at this point, I will toss it to our presenting team for any final thoughts or ideas, starting with Attorney Mello.
Sure, thank you, Chairman Calkett. I guess I thought this was a great meeting and discussion. I'm trying to, as I have listened and pondered over the last hour or so, I've been thinking about ways that we could address the question that Mr. Denver raised, and I think Mr. Haddad and Mr. Rand also raised the same or similar question regarding what we sought from JHA. Obviously I'm trying to tread carefully. It was the subject of a mediation, and I need to be respectful of that process. I will say that we fully vetted the matter before we proceeded, and I think we did all the analysis that I think was necessary to make it an appropriate and informed decision. I guess what I think we could say is that We did retain an expert, a well-regarded architectural expert, a dean at an architectural college, who did an analysis, and I guess I would characterize it as more of a preliminary analysis to the extent that it, we didn't proceed into full-blown litigation, and typically when you're in litigation, you do expert disclosures. Sometimes the experts are deposed, and it's a more fulsome process. We did do an initial analysis, and I think it's fair to say, what I think I can say is that according to his analysis, the roof issue, that change order comprised the lion's share of what he identified as a potentially an O claim. And, in addition to that, I think he identified that there could be responsibility for some portion of the delay claims that we had alleged. As I mentioned, delay analysis is a very technical, endeavor. We're talking basically about some portion of a few $100,000 worth of delay damages. And again, I want to underscore that with respect to the roof issue, the natural rebuttal to that is that although it was a change order, it's almost, now I don't want to oversimplify it, but it's like when you build a house and the plans omit the roof. Obviously the house needs a roof. So you get the roof, you pay for it. You don't get a free roof. That's the rebuttal to the argument that it really, that's the attack on the with respect to the harm element of the analysis. So, I want to tread carefully, but I think that might give some semblance of an idea of what we were looking at. I would hate for people to emerge from this meeting thinking that, we settle for 95 when our, appropriate recovery was many, many multiples of that. It's just not consistent with the analysis and the careful vetting process that we undertook and completed in determining how to proceed. So I just wanted to go back to that because I didn't, I respect the question. I appreciate the question, and it was raised by a few people. So I wanted to make sure we addressed it in a more, fulsome manner.
Thank you very much, Peter. Really appreciate it. Blake, anything from you?
I think I've covered everything.
You think you've done enough talking for one evening? Well, I did want to mention that we do very much appreciate the efforts of you, Peter, Matt, and everybody who has taken the time to provide insight and history and research to be able to put all this together. I think the value really can't be measured for the community as to all of the outstanding questions that we've had up until this point. And just with the core goal of being able to get everybody on the same page as to what we know and where we're at right now so we can start looking forward. So thank you very much for putting this all together in the delivery.
Of course.
I'll toss it around to the rest of the board for any thoughts and opinions. Anita?
Well, I think I would just want to reiterate what you said. A huge thank you to Clyde and Matt and Peter for all of the work to get this together. I really appreciate the transparency of things didn't go like we wanted them to go. Mistakes were made and it's on the table. And I think that well, it would be nice to go back in time and not have those mistakes happen. I appreciate living in a community that says, this is what we did, this is what we learned, and this is what we hope to do better. So I think that's really great. And thank you for making that possible.
Thanks, Anita. Cece?
Nope, I will just say what, I'll just echo Anita, per usual.
There's going to be a t-shirt made at some point, I can imagine. Ms. Whitney, I could see you furiously waving your hand over there. I imagine that means you have something to say.
Oh, I do this. Did I do that? I am unmuted. Yes, this is an amazing process. I've been sitting here taking notes, taking pictures. It's so huge. We built a house in Maine many years ago. It took about 2 weeks compared to what you guys have gone through. This is phenomenal. And I to echo what Anita said and what has been agreed with by other speakers. We are so blessed to have a very specific and detailed process like this presented to the public. And I look very much forward to the fire station, the whole process starting. I know so much more about it now that I'll just be a better listener and understanding the process due to this very detailed. And Blythe, I really appreciated your comments as well, where you, as it were, owned up, admitted that, yes, there were problems, and problems are really solutions in disguise, we used to say at school. So solutions are on the way. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Betsy. I sometimes get myself in trouble for being too blunt and straightforward. Maybe tonight is a good thing.
It's very good to not have to just get right to it is great. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Betsy. Mr. Haddad, I see that you have your hand up. Go right ahead, sir.
Thanks, Kevin. I just would like to make a suggestion. I've sat through a lot of the presentations that the school people have made about the Freeman Kennedy edition, and I know their need is, they would probably say it's probably as urgent, if not more urgent, than the fire station, because we have a space problem. So I guess that what I'm saying is I know both projects are imminent. So I would just ask the select board and Blythe, if when you're talking to the public or the taxpayers about what we need to spend in the future, if we could somehow at least talk to both of them so we get a full picture of what kinds of things are coming down the road, rather than piecemeal. We get here, you pass this one, oh, here's now another one, kind of thing. That's all. If you could just.
That's a great point. And I would suggest the first thing to look at is the capital improvement plan. It's a draft right now, and we'll get it it was on the website under a select board budget meeting, but it could be more prominently displayed. We've looked into the future for all departments, and while it's only 5 years into the future, it starts to give you that overview of what is coming and what, not everything's going to be funded, or certainly in the timeframes noted, but it helps you understand whether it be equipment or buildings or such that the town should expect to need to take care of. So we'll get that out to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. So with that, I believe that is the conclusion of our meeting this evening. Since this is a select board meeting, we will make a motion to adjourn. Do I hear a second?
Second.
We have a seconded motion. Any further discussion? Hearing none, we'll do a roll call vote. Kevin Calcutt, aye.
CC Van Tine, aye.
Anita Mecklenburg, aye.
And that is unanimous. Have a fantastic evening, everybody. Thank you so much.